So good evening. I am Donna Schneider, President of the Prince George's County Historical Society. We ask that you kindly mute yourself as we are recording the chat. We will be answering questions at the end. So please type any questions you may have in the chat box and we will get to your questions as afterwards. Hold on, somebody's in the, let me admit the person, thank you. If you enjoyed tonight's history chat, please consider making a donation or becoming a society member at pghistory.org. Now for tonight's history chat on African American genealogy. One of our newer board members, Damon Austin, is going to have a conversation with one of our longtime board members, Nathania Nay, or let's try this again. Nathania Nay, as she's known, Branch Miles, is a native New Yorker and has been a Maryland resident for 40 plus years. She is a life member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society and is a national chapter committee chair as well as an officer, member, and chairperson for the Prince George's County chapter. Ms. Branch Miles is an author, lecturer, adjunct professor, researcher, and family historian, writing books and articles about her family research, which covers research from South and North Carolina, Georgia, and the Republic of Cape Verde. She's also well-versed in Prince George's County history and the American Civil War. Nay is an active member of the community, serving on the Maryland Governor's Commission and Task Force on Black and Minority Health. Can't read this. As she's a commissioner for the county's Consumer Protection Commission and currently is a commissioner for the Prince George's County Historical Preservation Commission, along with being a member of several historical and genealogical societies. So welcome, Nay and Damon. It's over to you.
Thank you, Donna, and welcome everyone to our June history chat. And as Donna mentioned, we have Nathania Branch Miles, and she's going to offer us an informative and exciting conversation and information, quite a bit of information on how do we actually approach doing genealogical study and research ourselves, and as she will also detail some of her own experiences. So we all look forward to that. So Nathania, welcome, and I hope you can hear me well. Can you?
I can.
Okay. Can you
I can hear you very well.
Great. Can you start us off
by? Can you
by?
Hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can indeed. Can you start us off by just giving us an understanding of how in the world did you get started with genealogy in the first place, and your interest and background in genealogy?
My interest and background started with a third cousin on my maternal side who thought it was time that my family, my brothers and sisters and I learn who we came from.
I'm sorry.
And she gave me a list of information to some sort, you know, she just let me go on my own. But I just want to say that everybody who does genealogy does it for one reason, but most importantly, they want to know who they are and where they came from. They want to know why they do the things that they say that's because that's what my father did and his father did before him. Or they'll say, it's to know who starts these traditions. What is our legacy? People are like, who is searching for their family roots? Why? What do you have to gain? For me, it was a sense of belonging, learning where I came from. To begin with, researching your Afro-American genealogy is like eavesdropping. Sounds kind of cute, but eavesdropping, you don't know anything about it. If we use Alex Haley roots as our point of reference, you can see how important it was to listen to our elders when they were attending family gatherings. Alex remembered the stories of his grandparents and how they arrived in a new world. African American is a special to family history research, is like everyone else. There's nothing different, there's no special science or anything. We start our search at asking our parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, questions at looking at family scrapbooks, documents, photos, whatever they've been saving. We look at our immediate family and work our way back to the earliest known ancestor we can locate in the 1870 census, excuse me. However, our challenges for a paper trail become somewhat difficult before the 1870 census, as enslaved people pay off a mortgage. Here, the researcher goes one step further and becomes a creative detective and commences to follow the available paper trails through probate court, wills, estate sales, and bill of sale. I've been asked to talk about how I got involved in researching for my family roots, and I started my maternal ancestors in 1976 and my paternal ancestors in 1980. As I said earlier, I started out with literal locations. My third cousin told me that the list of parents and aunts and uncles that she gave me were related to the Donaldson and Parrish families in Bullock County, Georgia. At that time, I knew the names of my third great grandfather and grandmother, and that was Nellie Henshaw, Love Parrish, and their parents were John and Nellie Senior Henshaw.
We can't hear you. Are you, hello? Seems like we may have.
Connection.
Ah.
And surprisingly, everybody was connected. After searching the archives in the Bullock County Historical Society, Statesboro County Courthouse, it took me exactly 2 years to discover the common ancestor. And who is the common ancestor? That is the person that everybody in your family line can trace back to. My common ancestor was Andy Donaldson and Chloe. We never knew what her maiden name was, but she went back to like 1834. In fact, I can trace them back to their slave owners. During this time, I learned a lot about the hardships and tribulations that they went through during the post-slavery, the Great Migration, Jim Crow era, and that information helped me learn who my people were. Is there a question there? Do you have something, Damien?
Well, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I would just wanted to know, during those 2 years, because some of what you said faded in and out, you mentioned it took you 2 years to find some information. And during those 2 years of your research, how did you keep going despite some of the challenges, or some people refer to them as brick walls and other challenges? What gave you the momentum and the ability to continue on in this research, given all these challenges?
Well, it was very easy. I was able to trace everybody back.
Mm-hmm.
There were like 8 children on each side, and there was a lot of intermarriages. Not incest, but intermarriages. So you had a lot of double cousins. And once I was able to track down the cousins and the aunts and uncles that my cousin had left me, and they all came back to this one person, he was my common ancestor. That was Andrew Donaldson. He had 4 boys and 4 girls, and Cain and Isabel Parrish had 4 boys and 4 girls. And surprisingly, 2 sets on each side intermarried. So we had a lot of double cousins. They all stayed in Bullock County in a little town called Portal. And everything that I researched always came back to him. Always came back to him. So, you know, it was an incentive to keep going, because I knew that if I hung on long enough, I would find him. And I did. I mean, I stood up and started doing the dance in the archives. People were looking at me and they knew what was going on, and they say, whoa, congrats, congrats. So it was a really nice feeling. I mean, a lot of people now think that you can go to ancestry.com, throw these names in there, and all of a sudden, all this information is going pouring out. Ancestry.com only has what you put into it, what is copied from the census. Used to do the work. Used to have to make that bloodline work. You have to do that.
Well, that's
My
interesting.
maternal line led me down a different genealogical path in Bullock Creek, York County, South Carolina. My third great grandfather, Giles Good, was well known to the courts and was hung with a group of 5 men in the Hark of Bullock Creek. Now, the research steps were the same, and luckily the family pretty much stayed in the general area for several generations. But what made this side particularly easy to follow was the census. With the exception of the 1890 census, they were always there. You could find them, who they married and who they didn't marry, and their children. I had one uncle who had 22 children. That's a lot of children. But the good thing about the census was, especially in those days, people weren't migrating as much as they do now. They weren't even migrating as much as they did in the 1920s. But if you looked at your census page for your family and you look hard enough, you would find a brother or a sister on the lines above or the lines under, or even in the next page, because people had a tendency to stay close together. Plus, with the Goods, they were all buried in 1 or 2 local cemeteries, and the Historical Society had a file on Giles. The surrounding family was Giles, his wife Ann, and their 9 children, and they lived and died basically in York County, so that made life a whole lot easier. I had my own genealogical challenges that caused me to think outside the box. My largest brick wall was my paternal grandmother. It was sketchy. Now I say sketchy because I knew she was born February 1898. But surprisingly, I could not find her anywhere until 1920 when she was with her second husband. The only key thing there was that my father was with her, and by that time, he was only 4 years old. So it was very interesting how I lived for 20 some odd years, had several children, and she's on her second husband, and there wasn't a paper trail to tell you where she was, where she went, and until she was 20 something and she was living in New Jersey. Now, my paternal grandfather was even more interesting because he was a foreigner. He was an alien. In the 1920 census, I found him with his wife, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and it listed her as a citizen, but it listed him as an alien. And then that's when I started searching where he came from, and I found the manifest that showed that he came in New Bedford on May 14th, 1915, and he was only 16 years old. Now that was interesting because it took almost 6 months to get to New Bedford from Cape Verde, and I can't even imagine going to New York by myself at age 16. And we're talking about being on the water for that long a period, and he didn't travel with anybody. He didn't have any family members looking out for him. Now, you're going to ask me some of the sources that I use to help find my information, and everybody has to do this. I don't care who you are.
Right.
Conversations with your family members. You need to interview, and you need to interview all your elders now before they make that great transition into the big sky. Family Bibles. Now, Family Bible is almost as stink as the dodo bird because not a lot of people have them. And those who do are guarding them like it's Fort Knox. Local newspapers. Local newspapers will write down almost anything that you give it. Births, deaths, graduations, retirements, weddings. You know, anything that you submit to the newspaper, and if it's worthy and they got space for it, they'll put it in there. Now, the National Archives, which is also known as NARA, is one of the best places to go because not only do they have information on the federal census, you keep in mind, anything that's in NARA, all federal. The county historical societies, they all have information on the area, the people who live there. and the state archives. Now, the state archives will also have census, but they're on the 5th year. So whereas we have 1890 for the federal, 1895 would be for your state census. And only larger cities have a state census. And your county courthouse. The county courthouse will have all the information that you need on a particular family. Sales of the house, the property, mortgages, probate, estate sales, whatever that's related to the county that you have to deal, there is where your paper trail is. Do you have any question?
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. So one question I'd like to do is ask you, when you were finding the legal records, and did you discover anything unexpected in connection to history and cultural identity that you may have expected to find, or that you were told in some sort of family narrative?
Yes. One of the things that I was looking for with one of my grandmothers, Nellie Henshaw, that she was a Native American. Now, she was one of about 8 children, and I found it very interesting that out of 8 children, she's the only one who's a Native American. However, in checking out what was going on with her, I had to talk with a bunch of other cousins, and most of the cousins who I met at that time were in their 80s and 90s, and they were full of information. But the most interesting thing was that she went to Spelman. She graduated from Spelman as a teacher, trained for reading, writing, and arithmetic. She didn't have a diploma, but she went there from 1894 to 1897, which was good. I got the documentation from the Spelman Seminary archives. And the other thing that was interesting is when she went to this school, the seminary wasn't really called Spelman, it was called the Atlantic Bible School. And it didn't become the Spelman until the Rockefellers donated like $1 million for this school. And his only request was that they name it after his mother-in-law, who was a Spelman.
Very interesting indeed. And I wanted to go back very quickly because you mentioned one of your forebears traveled from Cape Verde, correct?
Yes, Cape Verde.
And how might an individual who have ancestors who've traveled, immigrated, a lot of people think Ellis Island is the only port of entry. Can you give us any more information on the varieties of how people have entered the country, and particularly in your family?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because you're correct. Everybody thinks everybody came through Ellis Island, and they didn't. There were lots of ports along the eastern seaboard. We're talking New Bedford, Massachusetts. You're talking state of New York. You're talking Louisiana, Florida. You're talking San Francisco, Galveston, the port of Galveston. And you're even talking about crossing the line from the United States to Canada, back and forth. Now, a lot of people do not know how important it is to find that information. And when you look on the census, it will tell you where they came from. It'll say their name, their age, and it'll ask, very general questions like, did you have any children? How long have you been married? Can you read? Just stuff that you kind of take for granted. But if you go a little bit further, they'll ask you, what is the nationality? And that's not the exact expression, but they want to know where your parents came from. And that's where you learn that your parents came from Portugal, England, Finland, New Mexico, Russia, Sweden, wherever. That's where you learn where they come from. And then you have to look at their age. At the time this census was, if they were 30 years old, then you need to go back to the next census to see if they're there, and if they are, how old they were. And then you just look at some of the manifests from those particular countries and the ports of call that they came into. and you check those. That's how I was able to find Antonio. I found him. It wasn't easy. It took a little while. I would say more than 2 years, but I found him, and the rest is history. I learned that he came here to New Bedford. He went with one of his cousins who lived there first. I think what they do in sociology, they say that you have a scout, and Antonio was a scout. He came to find out if this was a good place to come to live, if you could get a job, if you get a place to live, and he found it.
That sounds wonderful. And in doing your research, I have a question. Did you encounter any different county processes of clerks of the court or circumstances where previous county information was either merged or lost that that made you have to go through other channels?
That's really very important because, for instance, there was a period when Prince George's County went all the way to the Pennsylvania state line. And could you imagine being up there in Allegheny County and having to come down to Upper Marlboro to file your taxes, to pay your taxes, or to do whatever you need to do? And a lot of times it was just too hard for these farmers because everybody was a farmer. And so the counties, when they broke up, anything that was in the original county stayed in the original county. When they reestablished a new county, that county started brand spanking new. It got its own courthouse. It got its own police. Everything that it needed, it got independent. The other thing that you need to be very cognizant of is that the original county didn't share anything with the first county, the second county. They weren't obligated to. So you could have somebody who was born in Montgomery County and died in Prince George's County. The question is, when did the county split? And so you may have to do research in both counties just to find out what's going on. And you need to know the boundary lines. You need to know the history of the geographical areas that you're researching. And that's really very important because some people get hung up there and they don't understand why they can't find one of their ancestors.
Right. Those are some, that's a really valuable lesson to share with everyone who might be interested in research. And I'm curious, you mentioned that you provided the role of family historian for both sides of your family. And as a result of that research, did any family members' perspectives on the narratives change in any way after you brought back some of the information you found?
Yes, it did. On my paternal side, they were interested in why I wanted to find out about this particular family and what was my relation to them. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Goods had 9 children, and my third great grandfather was the son of Giles, and he was the 5th son. Unfortunately, he died young. I think he died before he was 25, so that made things a little harder. My grandmother always said that he died when she was young. The fact that she could say that, I assumed that he died when she was about 10 or 11. And you know, a kid at 10 or 11 would have a relatively good memory of their parents. But I later learned that he died when she was 5 years old. And that made a difference in terms of where I was looking and the time period I was looking in. And it would explain why I was not able to find her, because once her father died, her mother went back to her people. And unfortunately, I did not know her maiden name.
Speaking of names, it's very interesting because you had mentioned a little earlier about a number of cousins that were not so closely related had intermarried. And so you must have had a series of names repeating over certain generations. How was that? How did you navigate that process?
Well, but it's interesting that you would say that because I did have a problem at one point. My maternal cousins had a habit of always naming their children after the grandparents. So I would have like about 6 or 7 Marys. And it would be Mary Alice, Mary Jane, Mary Elizabeth, Mary Agnes. And then sometimes they unfortunately married the same name, James Hall. James Hall was very popular in Georgia, both black and white. They were very popular. So my cousin had helped me with that. Let me say this. I was using Family Tree Maker, the greatest little program you could ever meet. And every so often when I would be trying to match up these people, you know, like the sons and daughters, the computer, this woman is
Uh, hold on, Nate. 1 second. Can you, Nate? Can you
to
repeat?
be
I'm sorry.
the
Nate?
mother of this child.
Nathania, we lost you for about 15
So that
seconds.
told me
So
I was
you,
the wrong generation. Yes.
no, we lost you for about 30 seconds. So could you repeat that again?
I
Yeah, we were.
here.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. You were just a little bit spotty. So you were kind of discussing back. If you could go back to there were some James Halls, both black and white, and go from that point.
From what point?
When you said there were many James Halls, I believe you said it was a common name, both black and white.
Yes, there were many James Halls. Yes, so you know, yes, black and white. A lot of the people named their children the same. So you would have Susan Riggs marrying James Hall, and I had 2 or 3 of them in my family, but from 2 or 3 different generations. And luckily, they didn't all name their children in the same pattern or the same order. And like I said, my computer program would say that this person was too young to be the mother of that person. And then when I checked with one of my cousins, he told me that I had the right family, but the wrong generation. So that's when you start running into problems. You also start running into problems when you deal with nicknames. The people who took the census would never question anybody. If you had Poochie and Spike married, the guys never said, well, what is Spike's legal name? They would just put down Spike, you know, and so you would have a census that said that Poochie, who was really Francis, was married to Spike, you know, and you would have to do some matching. That's why I'm saying you have to do some creative detecting, because you'd have to figure out who their children were. And if you can figure out who their children were, then, you know, you stepped outside the box and you made a connection.
Were there any special ways or any special tricks you may or may not have them to how you did that detective work, how you figured out whose children were who? Was there any interesting stories or anything like that that you can give us and some insight into how cleverly you approach this?
Well, I asked a lot of questions. I did. You know, one of the questions that was asked to me, and it kind of insulted me at times, but what are you going to do with this information and why do you want to know? And I found out that there were a lot of secrets. And in genealogy, you'll find that secrets will go to the grave. If somebody says they can't tell you something and they don't believe it, they will take it to the grave. Now, if you ask them a question why, they'll say it is simple. It's not my secret to tell. So you have to respect that. But in terms of how I got around it, I just kept interviewing people. And, you know, I did have one problem where when I was writing up my reports, it always kept coming back to this one guy. And I kept thinking like, maybe there's another guy with the same name. And then I learned that Papa was a Rolling Stone. So therefore, he was the father of all these children with all these different women, all these different times. And everybody knew about it. They just didn't talk about it. So that was one of the secrets that they took to the grave.
Right. Yeah, actually, you lead me right into one of the, and you almost in part answered it, but I was going to ask you, do you ever find any information that seemed directly contradictory to what you had been told or not told by elders? And so you sort of touched on that. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Oh, there's probably a lot of things. I do know that when I met one of my elder cousins, her parents died when she was young, very young. And she was raised by her father's people, but she had pictures of her mother's people. And that's all she would say. You'd ask her, who are these people? And she'd say, oh, those are my mother's people. And I'd ask her, what was her mother's name? Well, they called her mother Maddie, but her name was really Martha. And I kept looking up all the information that I had. I said, if she's my cousin, she's got to be connected here some way. And then I found out that Martha's maiden name was Henshaw. And that led me to a whole different line of people. And then I also learned that they had older brothers who were responsible for them financially. So I was able to find that information at the courthouse when they prepared their reports of how they spent money from the family estate. So, and then when you read those papers, it opens up other doors where it tells you about the children who are older, younger, or the children who died.
That's very, very interesting indeed. And so we're kind of winding down on our time, but I want to ask you a couple more questions. Given your experience and research, do you feel American culture today regards family oral tradition and narratives as highly as American culture did when you were a child? And can you give me some of the nuances that you really appreciate from your childhood that may or may not exist today?
I have to say, I don't really think that they do. Our younger generation is so technically oriented that if they can't press a button to find it out, they're not interested. I have to say that when I first started, I wasn't all that intrigued. I'd even go as far as to say that when Alex Haley did his book Roots, I thought that was a good job. And that's as far as it went for me. But because I was I was a branch full of Parishes, Donaldsons, Goods, Bryants, and what have you. And that kind of worried me as to where did we come from? How come we're the only ones with this name? That's when I learned that my grandmother, my father's mother, had been married twice. That's why his name was different from his younger brothers and sisters. I also learned that the reason why my mother and her siblings were living with the Halls was because their mother died when they were 5, 3, and 1 years old from tuberculosis. But they stayed with the family. But again, the problem was there weren't a lot of people willing to tell you that information. Now, I didn't think that that was a secret worth going to the grave. But, I can tell you that when my great uncle died about 92, 94 years old, and I asked my mother, I said, I didn't know that Uncle Hubbard was your mother's brother. And she said, as simply as you please, I thought you knew. Now, I don't know how I would know if she didn't tell me. And I can tell you this, for all the years, and when my Uncle Hubbard died, I must have been about 25, 26. The thing that always stood out with me was that when he came to the house, everybody stepped outside. He was suffering from tuberculosis related illnesses, so all the smokers went outside to protect him. And not once did he ever say, it would have been nice if my sister had lived to see her grandchildren. Nobody ever made reference. Again, I think they always thought you knew. So it's very important that we share this information with our younger people, let them know, who their relatives are, what they did. I mean, you'd be surprised how many people will find out that, one of their relatives was a Buffalo soldier, Tuskegee Airman, that they, were in the Civil War. These are things that are kind of quiet as kept, as the expression goes. So I think it's important that we share this information with our families, our younger people, so that they do have a sense of pride in their family.
Well, it's interesting. You just actually went into my next question. Actually, you're doing this perfectly, because I was going to ask if you had any thoughts on how this technological dynamic, you think is affecting, in particular, the African American community and research methods in finding ancestry along our own lines.
Well, recently there was this big celebration about 1619, when the first Africans actually landed in Hampton, Virginia. And I was surprised at the number of people who had no idea what was going on. But more importantly, to me, it became more apparent that a lot of the schools are not teaching anything about African American history. You don't deal with African American history until you get into college, not even in high school. They think almost everybody who's Black was a slave, and that's not true. There were a lot of free Blacks. They do not know that it was important for the state of Maryland to have a special constitution to free the enslaved people, which was maybe 18 months to a year after the Emancipation Proclamation. These things are not taught in school. And so I'm looking at a complete, I wouldn't say negative, but a narrative that is not complete. It's not with full disclosure. And I think it's important that we start addressing those issues.
And your point that you make is a wonderful one. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, we have a brief discussion about, you said a lot of people think all black people were enslaved, some of them were free, but that's also, I think you know that sometimes people don't know that also where some of your ancestors are from, Cape Verde, the history there, Cape Verde, how the island changed hands politically, culturally, and how that affected your research.
Oh, it did affect my research in a great way. When I finally found Antonio in the manifest, it gave me the name of the ship that he came on, how much money he had, did he speak English, and where he was going. It said that he was going to his aunt's house in New Bedford. I even had an address, which I learned later that it was a boarding house. So not only was she prepared to take in her nephew, she was prepared to take in a lot of people from her home. Now, the one thing that I mentioned to you earlier offline is that everybody who travels away or they migrate away is to improve the quality of life. They're looking for a new job, to start anew. So it was important to find that out. But when looking for Antonio, everything said Portugal. And when I went directly to Portugal, Portugal would always refer me to Cape Verde. And when I went to Cape Verde, I found that there were 9 islands, of which 5 of them were habitable, but they import almost everything. The men are good sailors. They do, that's their trade. And a lot of times when the ships came in, they were able to go out as not so much like a support staff. So in other words, if a ship came in after being on the water for 6 months, and he was so happy to see a female, to touch the ground, to drink some rum, or whatever it was that he was willing to do, he might not make the departure. And the captain would say, he'd be right up there, he'd say, look, I got 5 spots. I need 5 guys. And then he'd go, you, and you. And that's how people would get on these ships. And it was interesting how that happened. But you also stated about the different cultures. Now, Cape Verde was one of those small little group of islands that was taken over by the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese at least twice in the course of 150 years. Now, they were close to, I like to think of Casablanca, but they weren't that close to Casablanca, but they were in that neck of the woods. But the thing was, you couldn't grow anything there. And so a lot of these people migrated all over the world. They migrated to Hawaii, Spain, Sweden, Germany, some of the Baltic islands. They went wherever the jobs were. So, and that made a difference in trying to, locate some of the family members. And I'd like to say that Cape Verde became independent from Portugal in 1975.
And one final question, because as we're running out of time, but one final question is just, do you have any additional suggestions you would have for researchers today, particularly African-American, but it can be people not limited to African-Americans, and some lessons learned that you might want to share.
My lessons learned is to be more organized. Don't take a lot of things for granted. Always be willing to go that extra yard. When I say be a creative detective, you know, that sounds like kind of cutesy, but it really means that you need to really start looking at different things. I think the city directory started in the early 1900s, and people are surprised at what information you can find in the city directory. Anybody who put their name in there, it listed the main person who was there, like the father, his occupation, his wife, and anybody who lived with him, like his children, maybe his mother-in-law. And the city directories were usually for major cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., New York City, Rochester, Atlanta. They would have city directories, and the city directories went far and wide. So if you went to Atlanta, it didn't just include Atlanta, it included the surrounding counties, you know, and it wasn't always just businesses that were there. You had to pay something, but they were before you got the telephone directory. You know, if you looked in those things, you could find them. And you could look at the Library of Congress for the city directory, and that could be the beginning of your search if you can't find somebody.
So at some level, it could have, a person's economic standing could affect whether or not they were even entered into the local registry.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah,
That
very,
is
very interesting
true.
indeed. Interesting indeed. Well, thank you for all of your information. This has just been a wonderful learning experience for all of us. And at this point, I guess Donna will have us
Well, at the
answer some questions.
moment, I was gonna say, at the moment, there aren't any questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat box and we'll answer your questions. But actually, I have a question for Nay. Since you did research for your relatives in Cape Verde, did you actually go there to do research, or was it all
No, I
online?
still plan to go there. They the embassy in Cape Verde up until recently used to do a research trip every year. I learned about that not too long ago. And I did a lot of communication with the embassy in terms of trying to find the churches. I assumed that he was Catholic because most of the countries who occupied them were basically or majority Catholics. That was not true. There were also Hasidic Jews there and Muslims. I would say that Antonio Gomes was not a Muslim. So I have to believe that he was of the Jewish faith. But the other interesting thing that I found, and it was kind of disheartening, because once I found him, I thought he'd just pop up and say, "Hey girl, here I am." But Antonio Gomes is like John Brown. You know, it's a very common name. And not only is it a very common name, it's a common name for people in South America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Spain, anywhere where you have people with a Spanish speaking group. You know, it was just interesting because, you know, even when I found out what his parents' name was, that didn't help me that much. And I wrote to churches trying to get baptismal certificates or information on that. And I was successful getting some information and narrowing things down. But he's still elusive. He's still elusive. I can tell you this. He's a bunch of draftees for World War I. And I used to think that he was in the Army, but he was really in the Navy.
Okay.
Now, when I try to get information, the only handicap that I have is that I don't have a date of birth. I do have a copy of his affidavit for marriage. And the licenses at that time didn't ask for date of birth. It just asked you where you came from, what your age was, and where you lived.
Yeah, I've run into the same problem doing my genealogy of not having dates of birth. And I've gotten stuck because of that. Does anybody have any
It
questions?
is kind of hard.
No,
So no more questions?
no more questions. I say, Damon, did you have any more that you didn't ask?
No, I think, again, Nay has just done such a wonderful job of giving us information. She's kind of taken us through the process, through some of her own personal challenges and how she's, overcome hurdles and issues. And it shows that oftentimes, we have she persevered even through, like, especially one thing that stuck out with me was her point about family secrets. Sometimes she had to persist, sometimes she would get that information. Sometimes she wouldn't, because people are oftentimes willing to take things to the grave, and especially of prior generations, So I just thought it's just a wonderful experience for us, I think, and I'm very thankful that Nay did share all of our information.
Okay, well, I want to thank Nay and Damon for tonight's chat and for everybody who joined us. Our next chat is on July 26th, and it will be a conversation with Daniel Tanna, who's from our Historic Preservation section of the Countywide Planning Division of Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. He's going to talk about the county's historic preservation grant program. So all of our history chats will be are being recorded, and they will be online. You can find them on our website, pghistory.org, and on our YouTube channel. There's a link on our page. So I want to thank everybody again for joining us, and hopefully you can join us for next month's presentation. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.